Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. First item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the Scottish Government's legislative consent memorandum on the UK Internal Market Bill. We're taking evidence this morning from the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. Mr Russell is joined today by supporting officials Ewan Page, who's the head of the UK Frameworks Unit, and Graham Fisher from the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. Warm welcome, Mr Russell, to the meeting this morning, and invite him, if he so wishes, to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to be back here giving evidence on the bill. I'd much rather not be doing so, because this bill represents an assault on devolution, the like of which we have never experienced since the Scottish Parliament was established. And therefore I think it is the duty of every MSP to oppose it at every turn. It will open the door to a race to the bottom on food standards, environmental standards, and it will endanger key public health policies such as minimum unit pricing. It will deliver a hammer blow to the Scottish economy by making it harder for the UK government to conclude free trade agreements if other countries think that the UK won't meet its obligations. It's damaging to businesses and consumers in Scotland and more widely across the UK. Dedicated on leaving the UK single market of 450 million people, and it means losing the benefits of variations in approach to reflect consumer preferences and health and environmental considerations in Scotland, and the advantages of high quality regulation of food products and other products. We already know that the Internal Market Bill would take a wrecking ball to devolution. But using the Internal Market Bill to renege on parts of the withdrawal agreement is extraordinary. It will not only alienate the EU, which it has done, it will increase the likelihood of a low or no deal exit, and it will also damage and is damaging the UK's international standing and future relationship. Moreover, the lack of adequate time to properly scrutinise the proposals suggests that the UK government itself has little confidence in them. It is looking to push the bill through Westminster as rapidly as possible in order to avoid proper scrutiny. The Scottish Government is absolutely clear. This is backed up by the views of stakeholders across Scotland, as we have seen in recent weeks. The correct and proportionate means of dealing with these issues is through the Common Frameworks process, which, despite our differences over EU exit, has been able to make significant progress over the last several years. The Scottish Government cannot recommend consent to a bill that undermines devolution in this way and breaks international law, and that is why the LCM that we have published makes that crystal clear and will invite the Scottish Parliament to reject the bill.
Cabinet Secretary, I may start in the area of common frameworks myself. Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government's LCM states that the Internal Market Bill is not necessary and undermines both devolution settlement and agreed processes that are already established to agree common frameworks and ways of working across the UK following EU exit. However, the UK government states that without a substitute framework for EU governance, there's a risk of new regulatory barriers being erected that could bring significant disruption, not just to the wider UK economy, but also to businesses in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland individually. Is this risk real, and what is the Scottish Government's view?
The risk is not real. In the last 4 years, there has never been an indication of any issue on which there would be that difficulty. This is a set of solutions in search of a problem. But the UK government's own line is changing constantly. I want to, if I might, Convener, make a very strong point at the outset of this. I listened with astonishment this morning to Good Morning Scotland and to a man called Paul Scully, who, to the best of my knowledge, I've never met, who is apparently the small business minister. And he said during his interview, and I want to quote him because it is absolutely untrue, but it also indicates the changing story. Part of the reason we are in this place in the first place, this is about the bill, we were dealing with common frameworks to try and build things to consensus, free so far, but the Scottish Government pulled out of that some time ago. And we need to get them back to the table to make sure we can build that consensus, because that is good for Scottish business. And later on he said, the reason we're legislating in the first place is because the Scottish Government walked away from some of the common framework discussions we were having last year. That is categorically untrue. We have been working solidly on the common frameworks with the UK government. And I said to this committee the last time I appeared in front of it, we wish to complete that process. We wish them to be negotiated and agreed, and we will operate as if they are all in place from the 1st of January next year, the day after transition. There is no danger at all of a difficulty with the single market. The common frameworks were designed to deal with that matter, and now, unfortunately, here's the UK that is walking away from the common frameworks because they wish to force the devolved administrations, all of them, to accept really bad trade deals and much lower standards. Now, I would also ask Mr. Scully now to withdraw these remarks, which are absolutely untrue, and which are, if I presume they are made out of ignorance. If they are not, then the situation is even more serious than we think.
Again, in the common frameworks theme, Cabinet Secretary, the legislative consent motion states that common frameworks approach provides all of the claimed objectives of the bill in guaranteeing market access across the UK, and the UK government states that as the frameworks are limited to a specific number of policy areas, they'll not be able to provide a comprehensive safety net for businesses and consumers. Again, do you agree that frameworks are limited to a specific number of policy areas? What's the Scottish Government's view? And perhaps you could give us an update on where things have actually reached with common frameworks, given the earlier quote that you provided us with.
I don't agree that they're limited. They cover a wide range of areas, and indeed they cover these areas specifically because all the other areas which we looked at, the so-called 156 areas, didn't need common frameworks because there were already arrangements in place that would more than adequately deal with the relationships between the four nations. But if any of the four nations thought that there was a weakness or a gap, they only have to say so, and we can work very hard to get that framework in place. I heard Michael Gove say that some weeks ago, and I made it absolutely clear to him at the time. If he can identify an area in which he doesn't think the common frameworks are effective or covered, then we will very quickly deal with that by negotiation. Now, we have a number of common frameworks ready to go, but we can accelerate that process, but we can also operate as if these are in place because we know what they cover. I have in front of me, in actual fact, two of the consultation documents on the common frameworks, food and food safety and hygiene. And it does give a complete coverage of the issues and what should take place. But moreover, it says that in actual fact, there can be dispute resolution within them. There can be agreement on how they operate. These are exactly what they are meant to. These are the way in which we should work together. This was agreed. We agreed the principles and we agreed how to take it forward. And I would, even at this very late stage, say to the UK government, come back from the brink, work on the common frameworks. You will find that the four administrations, the three administrations with whom you are now in dispute, because Wales and Northern Ireland have also voted against this approach, then come back to the table on this and we can get this to work well.
Finally, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned a consultation process in that answer there. We have had some expressions of frustration from stakeholders about not being able yet to see any common frameworks. So can you tell us a bit more about what that consultation is actually about and when it might take place?
Well, I'm going to provide the committee, if you allow me to, very quickly with consultations on two of the common frameworks which are ready to go. Quite clearly, things have been held back by the pandemic, but we are committed to putting these into place. But we also know what they should look like. So we can say, without any doubt at all, we will operate as if they are in place, whilst they are scrutinised, whilst they are looked at, so that they can come into place. And we've also got a commitment to scrutiny across the four administrations. This would seem a sensible, grown-up way to deal with the way in which we will interact after an act which we don't agree with, not just leaving the EU, but then leaving the transition period. And it's all there and already. And the way in which it's now being treated by the UK appears to be designed to undermine the common frameworks, despite all the work that has gone into them, in order to allow them a justification, casus belli, a justification for putting a disastrous and wrong bill into operation.
Okay, I understand Alexander Burnett would like to also ask questions in this area. Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. And yes, just staying on common frameworks and consensus, the latest quarterly update shows progress on common frameworks. but it's clear that not all are going to be concluded by the end of the year. So I'm going to ask a more fundamental question. Yeah? Do you not understand, but whilst your calls are for these to be completed, people just find it incredible you're spending your time plotting out fantasy scenarios of separation, which have the ironic objective of ending the UK single market. So can I just ask, how can you say one thing but be actively pursuing another?
Well, I can quite easily do it by saying that we have to make the best of a bad set of circumstances on a vote to leave the EU, which the Scottish people, including your constituents, did not back. Now, they have been immensely reasonable in trying to negotiate the common frameworks so that there is no friction, because I don't want to see any friction. There is no need for friction. And that is why we agreed to take part. And in the previous Tory administration, which I never thought I'd look back with fondness, but with David Lidington in place, we all agreed that we could sit there and work on these and get these to work. Unfortunately, since then, there has been a deliberate attempt to undermine the devolved administrations. And what Mr. Scully has said this morning is utterly disgraceful. And I hope you will distance yourself from this, because what he is endeavouring to do is to blame the Scottish government for the disastrous decision that the UK government has made on this bill.
Yeah, well, you say that, but people like Sir Tom Hunter have clearly lost trust in you to prioritise correctly. But more relevantly, the Eclair Committee has just published their latest report, and in it they've specifically drawn to this committee's attention the Scottish Government's failure to engage with stakeholders in relation to common frameworks. So, I mean, you're getting quite a reputation now for failing to engage. How is this attitude in Scotland's interest?
I'm not getting a reputation for anything other than painstaking work to try and make sure that we have a reasonable relationship in these islands. Unfortunately, that is being disrupted by the government, which regrettably you support. The reality of the situation, I think you shouldn't also call people out in terms of supporting you without reading what they say. I read the Tom Hunter contribution, and I thought it was entirely a reasonable contribution. And in terms of engagement with the common frameworks, I've explained to you the difficulty that existed during the pandemic, which I might have thought you would have realised, but also the commitment I have made. And I give it to you again now, absolutely to your face, that we will operate as if the common frameworks are in place, and we make a commitment to do so from the 1st of January at the end of transition. I think that the time you're spending on criticising the Scottish Government should be spent criticising the UK Government for pursuing a ridiculous Brexit in the most damaging way possible. Thank goodness we have responsible administrations in the other areas of the UK that are endeavouring to try and get a reasonable set of compromises.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, Murdo Fraser, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to pick up on one comment you made in response to the Convener's questioning earlier. Is it not the case that the Scottish Government disengaged in the spring of 2019 from discussions with the UK Government around the UK internal market?
No, what Mr. Scully said, let's deal with this once and for all, and then I hope...
No, I'm not asking Mr. Scully, I'm asking you a direct question. The point that you're making. Mr. Scully said they were using the framework to try and build consensus. They have to get us back to the table to make sure we can build that consensus. It's good for Scottish business. The reason we are legislating in the first place is because the Scottish Government walked away from some of the common framework discussions. That did not happen. We refused to enter into discussions on the internal market because the internal market was going to lead to where we are now. Indeed, rather interestingly, the experience of the Welsh Government on that is very illustrative of the problem which we predicted. And if I may quote my Welsh counterpart, because he made this point very, very clearly to the Westminster Committee, it was agreed this would be a joint piece of work that is on the internal market. But it's wholly unacceptable that now we are faced with a solely UK government-generated proposal. It's a missed opportunity to show we can work collaboratively. I absolutely believe from the beginning that that's what would happen. That is what is happening. And I think every MSP should be defending the Scottish Parliament and the work we do for the Scottish people, not, unfortunately, supporting the biggest power grab that we have ever seen on the devolved powers, which will affect every single one of our constituents, including yours.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You very helpfully clarified that the Scottish Government did walk away from discussions around the UK internal market in spring 2019. So thank you for doing that. Perhaps I go on and ask another question. We've heard as a committee from various business representative organisations and trade bodies about the need for this bill, about how they value the UK internal market and how that needs to continue operating after the end of this year. And we all also know, of course, that the UK internal market is worth to Scottish business 3 times what the EU single market is worth to them. So does the Scottish Government recognise the value of the UK internal market and therefore recognise that this bill is necessary?
The two things are not synonymous. I recognise the need to continue the trading that takes place, and I want that to happen. And that can happen with the common frameworks. Indeed, this bill will damage that process and will damage it very substantially. But let's be straight about what stakeholders are saying. Who should we start with? Should we perhaps start with the National Farmers Union of Scotland? It is a clear view of the NFU Scotland and other farming unions of the UK that proposals present a significant threat to the development of common frameworks and to devolution. We could certainly look at the Scottish Council for Development and Industry. The SCDI is not convinced that the legislative approach proposed in the white paper is the right priority. We believe that mutual recognition to work in practice and maintain support common frameworks agreed through intergovernmental negotiations should be the foundation of the UK internal market. We could go, of course, to the General Teaching Council, which expressed recently severe concerns. We could go to the Royal Corporation of Architects of Scotland. We could go to the Law Society for Scotland. I think you will find that any attempt to present this as some unanimous view that this bill is wanted would be deeply flawed. This is probably why the UK government will publish all the submissions.
I'm sure we could trade quotes all morning, but can I just ask you maybe my final question? We're of course doing this process in parallel with the EU continuity bill, which the committee will be looking at later on in this session. Is the Scottish Government effectively making the wrong choice here, trying to align the Scottish economy and the requirements of Scottish business with the EU, as opposed to aligning with the rest of the UK? Because in the event that there's a conflict between the two, is it not overwhelmingly in the interests of Scottish business and the Scottish economy that our alignment is with the rest of the UK, given that it's worth 3 times what the EU market is worth to Scottish business?
I believe the EU is the UK's biggest single market, and therefore what the UK is endeavouring to do is exactly what you're saying, to have the best of both worlds. That's what I'm trying to secure for Scotland too, to have the best of both worlds at this stage. I believe profoundly that my constituents and your constituents, and your region anyway, the people in your region, voted to stay in the EU because they realise how important that is. I am trying to make sure that we get as many benefits as we can from the appalling situation which your UK Tory government has put us in, and that is my obligation. Now, I'm trying to make sure, for example, on high standards, we keep those high standards, but I'm also trying to make sure that we have in the common frameworks the tools that are needed, if they were needed, to work against any barriers. So I don't believe those barriers exist. I'm doing precisely what I should be doing against, I have to say, the headwind of the UK Tory government, which regrettably you are supporting in its action.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Murdo. I'm now going to Alec Rowley, supplementary. Alec Rowley.
It's the facts. So, firstly, can Mr. Russell confirm that the Scottish Government have been working on the common frameworks, and that the UK Minister to suggest this morning the need for this bill is down to the Scottish Government is an absolute lie? And let's call things what they are. And then, secondly, in terms of the common frameworks themselves, Mr. Gove yesterday, when asked about this, said that common frameworks were a big part of this approach in terms of the internal market, but could not deliver on their own. He then was unable to say in what areas common frameworks could not work. So could the Cabinet Secretary perhaps also comment on that, and whether the view of the Scottish Government is that common frameworks could have been able to resolve the issues that potentially come with Brexit for the internal market?
Yes. Let me start with the point you make about Mr. Scully. If Mr. Scully said the reasons we're legislating in the first place is because the Scottish Government walked away from some of the common frameworks discussion we were having last year, that is either because he does not know the truth, because he is not telling it. So, I mean, I cannot say which it is, but I hope that if it is a former, he will apologise. If it's a former, he will get himself informed pretty quickly, as a business minister should. In terms of the common frameworks and the work that's being done, I look at the team of people I've had who've been working on the common frameworks for a very long period of time, and I see the enormous amount of hard work they have put in to try and make this work. We committed ourselves from day one to the common frameworks. In actuality, it was the UK that dragged its feet for a whole period of time, as it always does. And the Welsh and ourselves have worked very hard to make sure this is picked up again after the difficulty of the coronavirus and is taken to conclusion. I have to say, I feel angry enough about Mr. Scully, but I do know my officials feel even more angry, because what is happening here is an attempt to rewrite history, essentially, and that is utterly unacceptable. And I do think there has to be a level of honesty in politics, a substantial level, which just falls well short of. So I'm going to assert the truth today.
Okay, can we move on, please, to Patrick Harvey?
Thank you, Convener. Can I just pick up very briefly first on this debate about common frameworks? And you say there needs to be a level of honesty. There also needs to be a level of trust, that the common frameworks approach relies to a large extent on trust between the two governments in both directions. What basis for trust is there when you have a UK government willing to publish a bill which breaches international law? If it's willing to break its promises to its international partners, what basis is there for having trust in reaching common frameworks with them in relation to partners within the UK?
It's a very good question, Mr. Harvey. I mean, I've spent 4 years negotiating with the UK government in what I can only describe as deteriorating circumstances. And I would like to think that the work we put in on the common frameworks is not wasted. And therefore, if the UK government were to see sense on the internal market bill, then we could get, over time, a workable set of arrangements. And I'm prepared to commit myself and the Scottish government to that. But I think the UK government has severely underestimated the impact of what it has done on the question of international law. I think they do not realise how difficult this has made things, for example, in the current EU negotiations, not just in coming to a conclusion, because there may be a low deal of some sort, but what will be the long-term damage in this, where you cannot trust a government to keep to its word. And the Law Society draws attention to this in its submission to you, as you're well aware. I'm still an optimist, though I have no reasons to be one, I have to say, but I'm still an optimist that we can get the frameworks to work. And I think that the other devolved administrations want to do the same, but the UK government would have to turn over a new leaf. And it will have to do that anyway, with the EU, given the position that the EU has taken. If you look at the statement from the Joint Committee, the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Monday, it is absolutely clear that there is a long way to go before the EU redeem other countries.
Can I move on then and ask you about the evidence session that we had with Michael Gove yesterday? On a number of occasions, made an attempt, let's say, to set out reasons why there were issues that were incapable of resolution through common frameworks and therefore required this bill. In relation to a number of the objections which have been raised, not just by members, by expert evidence, his response was to wish it away and essentially say, no, that isn't an issue, it just isn't an issue. And when faced with examples of areas which are clearly devolved, which would be within the scope of UK centralised control, he seemed not to be willing to engage and simply to ask for more examples. Was there anything in Michael Gove's evidence yesterday to which that you found unexpected, or that was new, or that represented any kind of acknowledgement of the concerns that have been raised by a number of distinguished expert witnesses during this inquiry?
Regrettably, there was nothing new either in content or in style, I have to say, and both would have been welcome. But I do think that there were certain things that could be challenged. For example, the constant implication that the EU was more prescriptive and constraining than the bill is entirely wrong. He ignores the very profound differences between the bill which he has brought forward and actually how the EU operates. The development of the European single market and internal market has been based on equality, cooperation, co-decision, subsidiarity and consent. Now, all of those are not part of the UK bill. This is as if the largest member of the EU, say Germany, simply sets the terms, said there can be no departure from them, there can be no debate about them, and the German conditions will always apply. Anybody who knows anything about the UK EU single market just knows that that is a total perversion of the truth. The European single market rules also allow for policy objectives alongside pure market considerations. For example, the health benefits of minimum unit pricing. And in terms of small amendments that have been made to the bill, they make no difference whatsoever on this, because it is still perfectly possible for ministers, particularly Bayes ministers, to overrule the Scottish Parliament. And we've seen today with Mr. Scully that Bayes ministers appear to be, at the very best, woefully ill-informed about reality.
Which leads me to my final question. Realistically, there was no chance yesterday that Michael Gove and I were suddenly going to agree on the nature of this bill. There's very little chance that you and Michael Gove will agree on the nature or the need for this bill. But here we are. And not only do we have a bill which threatens to overrule devolved competence in devolved areas, but we have a government which is very clearly, explicitly willing to pass this bill against the explicit refusal of consent. What is the Scottish Government intending to do about that fundamental assault, which seems to me entirely out of keeping with the 2016 Scotland Act? These are, in terms of devolved competence, normal circumstances. The Scottish Parliament is operating normally, not in abeyance as the Northern Ireland Assembly was a while ago. It seems to me that for the UK to pass this bill against the refusal of consent would be a breach of the 2016 Scotland Act, that question should be tested, and that if they do this against the refusal of consent, the exercise of the powers this bill gives them would be wholly illegitimate. What is the Scottish Government, what action is the Scottish Government proposing to take in those circumstances?
Oh, we must move step by step as the steps are in front of us, but I do not rule out at the end of those steps further action which has not been taken before. You have raised with me before the question of the 2016 Scotland Act. I think that is one of the legal issues, but there are other legal issues that need to be considered. But the next step of this is, I hope that the committee will agree that the bill should not be supported. The legislative consent motion will be debated in the Scottish Parliament next week. The bill still has to go to the House of Lords. We will continue to brief members of the House of Lords about this and to make the points we have. If the bill were to leave the House of Lords and succeed, then we would then at that stage, of course, be looking at legal action. It is very difficult to take legal action against something that is not law. There is nothing unlawful about the Commons or any other Parliament considering a bill. This is a thoroughly offensive, bad bill which should never have come to the House of Commons, but that is not the same as it being illegal. The question is, when we get to a bill that is on the statute book, does it conform with a variety of pieces of legislation, starting with the Act of Union and no doubt taking us all the way to the 2016 Scotland Act? And I am fully mindful of that fact. I wouldn't go any further than that, but I do not intend to cease arguing against, fighting against, endeavouring to defeat what is a major paragraph.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Tom Arthur, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Considering the bill as amended, Schedule 2 Part 1 lists services which are exempt from mutual recognition. One of those services is healthcare services, and examples given include healthcare services provided in hospitals, other healthcare facilities or at other places, xenotransplantation, human genetics, human fertilisation, embryology, services in connection with surrogacy. Yesterday I asked Mr Gove why healthcare services was included within this schedule. His answer to the committee, and I quote, is because we wanted to be absolutely and unambiguously clear that our NHS is not for sale. That naturally prompts a question: what would be the consequences of healthcare services not being within Schedule 2? Mr Russell, does the Scottish Government have a view on what the consequences would be were healthcare services not to be included within Schedule 2, which exempts services from the mutual recognition principle?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points on that. First of all, I think the exemptions in the bill more generally are capable of override. I think there is sufficient wriggle room for, say, American healthcare companies to be able to use the bill and the courts. This is a point that Martin Callanan, Lord Callanan, the UK minister, Bayes minister, made in the House of Lords when the consultation was ongoing. The courts could be used to force the health service into this. I do not believe that there is a total exemption. I would want to see that there was no inclusion, but I don't want to see this bill at all. I mean, the issue of exempting things accepts that this bill should exist in a sense, and I do not accept that this bill should exist. The frameworks are what we need, and the frameworks are how we should operate. But in terms of healthcare, it is, in my view, perfectly possible that this bill will be used, for example, on issues of procurement in the health service, where independent healthcare companies will be able to force themselves into the Scottish Health Service because they are recognised and able to do so in the health service south of the border. And of course, if you go back to the core purpose of this bill, the core purpose of this bill is to make sure that the devolved administrations cannot interfere with trade outcomes, trade relationship outcomes. And health will be part of some of those FTAs. We've drawn attention to the fact, for example, that in the Japanese FTA, which they are proudly crowing about, there is in actual fact, a weakening on microbial resistance. There are issues in here which we believe are deeply damaging, and I do not accept the word of any UK minister that could not happen.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's useful. If I understand you correctly, you would suggest that the bill as drafted, even with the exemption from mutual recognition from healthcare services, is anything but watertight. Beyond that, though, you'll be aware that Clause 17 of the bill as amended confers a power on the Secretary of State through the affirmative procedure to make changes to the schedule, including the removal of items listed on it, and further Clause 17.4 allows the made affirmative procedure to be used within the first 3 months of the bill coming into the force. I wonder if you have any comments to make with regards to why you think the UK government would want to reserve that power for itself, if indeed the case is that the purpose of healthcare services being listed is to avoid any suspicion that the NHS may be up for sale. Why would the UK government want to give itself a power to remove, without parliamentary approval, that safeguard, as they would describe it?
Well, the main affirmative procedure, of course, is for things of extreme, what is used for the coronavirus regulations. I think if they are allowing themselves to do that in the first 3 months, then they want to do some pretty dramatic things as quickly as possible, with as little scrutiny as possible, which is very typical.
So the final question I would ask is, I've tried to get an understanding of the UK government's position. Mr Gove was dismissive of concerns that the NHS may be at threat, dismissing it as, I believe, conspiracy theories or words to that effect. Is it the view of the Scottish Government that this bill presents a clear and present danger and threat to the Scottish NHS?
Yes, Michael Gove dismissed not just the NHS. I mean, Michael Gove dismissed criticism of this bill as being for the birds. The bird in question in this bill is a chlorinated chicken. There is the absolute likelihood, in my view, that standards will be lowered no matter what is said, and that those lowered standards will be forced on Scotland. That is what this bill is about. That is why this bill is here, and that is what will happen. And it will not just happen on very serious matters such as foodstuffs and environmental standards. It will be able to happen on other areas. I mean, one of the more incredible are teaching qualifications and building standards. You thought teaching qualifications were just obvious because we have a register and they don't have south of the border. We have a compulsory qualification for headship now. They don't have that south of the border. But that still is in play here, as the GTC has been forced to say. And on the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland has been very clear. There have been separate and different building regulations in Scotland since time immemorial. Why would you try and do anything about them? It's nothing to do with devolution, unless you were trying to create the circumstances where standards could be lowered and essentially that those lower standards could get you trade deals with people. So, I mean, it just seems absolutely obvious to me. And now, Mr. Scully's smokescreen today tends to think that they're trying to find another excuse for the bill. They should be harassed mercilessly on this until they tell the truth about it.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. No further questions, Convener.
Thanks, Tom. Alec Rowley, do you still wish to come in this area? Because I think you indicated earlier your interest.
No, I'm fine.
Thank you very much. Okay, Dean Lockhart, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Yesterday, the committee heard evidence from Michael Gove that the UK internal market proposals will deliver additional spending in Scotland from the UK government, and that this additional spending will be over and above Barnett consequentials. Does the Cabinet Secretary welcome this additional spending and investment coming from the UK government?
I always welcome the expenditure of money in Scotland. I'd like to see Scotland with full control of its own resources, spending money it has, resolving the old Highland problem of applying the resources of the Highlands to the problems of the Highlands. We should do that at the Scotland level. But I am sceptical about additional funding for the devolved administrations because I really do doubt whether that will happen. But in addition, I think you have to be very careful about the conflicts that could arise in spending money. For example, if you take a transportation issue, we might say, and I think it wouldn't be unwise to say, that at the present time you would want to at least have reservations about endless continued road building. That is not the position of the UK government. So they might say, we're going to do this, and we're going to say, well, actually, we're trying to reduce car use. We take another example on privatisation of the health service. That they could argue, we're going to build a set of private clinics, and we're saying, well, that's not the policy of the health service. So I think you have to have coordination. Now, these monies are meant to replace the monies that were coming from regional funds, social fund, and other European funds. There is the total, the quantum will be the same, and there is those funds are presently spent in consultation in a consultative way. There is no commitment to that. So I do not, until I see not just the colour of the money, but the arrangements and the safeguards, then I'm afraid I am sceptical.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Well, I'm glad you are welcoming the proposal for additional money to be spent by the UK government in Scotland in the same way as GERS figures show that the UK government expenditure in Scotland means that we can, per head of population, spend much higher sums of money on public services in Scotland than would otherwise be the case. But let me come back to the point you made about existing EU structural funds. It seems that you prefer decisions on spending in Scotland to be made by EU institutions instead of spending decisions being made on a collaborative basis with the UK government. Is it not better that investment and spending in Scotland be made on this basis. One example being the city deals, which involved a joint agreement on spending in Scotland between both the UK government and the Scottish government. But more importantly, the city deals involved joint working with local authorities and other community organisations. Is that model not the best way to agree collaborative spending and additional spending coming from the UK government in Scotland?
You make a number of points there. Let me address them all. Firstly, thank you for mentioning GERS. I think it is always important to point out the woefully incompetent management of public finances from the UK and Scotland over the long term, and the fact that we need independence in order to move on from that. So thank you for helping me to make that point. The second one is I do not share your implacable hostility to the EU. I noticed, for example, that Alex Sharma was doing the same to Ian Blackford yesterday. Nor do the Scottish people share that implacable hostility. The Scottish people voted 62 to 38. Indeed, the figures would now indicate that the majority is even bigger, against leaving the EU. So they did not see the EU as some monolith that was making distant decisions. They saw it as a collaborative venture. And indeed, the UK government has now put itself outside the pale on international law. Its rhetoric against working with others is appalling. Can I answer all the questions? Can I answer all the questions? I'm endeavouring to do so. I'd be happy to answer the questions, and it would be useful, perhaps, if I did, and then we could move on. The reality is, and I am not hostile to the EU. I don't want the EU to make all the decisions. I want to make decisions collaboratively. And just in terms of what lies next, if Michael Gove had yesterday come forward with the clear structures that were going to be put into place, in terms of spending this money, then we would be able to discuss them sensibly. He did not come forward with the clear structures. He made a series of vague generalizations. So if you are in possession yourself of the clear structures that would, for example, build on the city deal, I'd welcome them. Otherwise, I would want to look at the clear structures we have in the collaborative spending of EU funds, which were involving the widest range of people, including local authorities, to ensure that that money was spent well. I do hope that the UK government intends for that to happen. I doubt it, however.
Thank you, Convener. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener and Cabinet Secretary. You've already mentioned teachers and professional qualifications, which I wanted to ask you about, because I tried to ask Mr. Gove about that yesterday, and he really ignored my question and just said that the UK did not plan to interfere in Scottish education. So I'd be interested in your angle on that, the fact that he ignored the question, and are you concerned that we could see teachers coming into Scotland who don't match normal qualifications?
Well, Mr. Gove, of course, like myself, is a former education secretary, and that is when we first, so to speak, shadowed each other. So we go back a long way, and he is a strong opponent of compulsory registration in the National Register. He has been a proponent of teaching in schools by those who do not hold a professional qualification. That is not the situation in Scotland, and indeed I hope it is not the situation anybody believes it should prevail in Scotland. Now, it is absolutely clear, and the GTC have made that point. The GTC are an independent body. I know that because I gave them their independence. So they're a totally independent body. They're not part of government, and we enacted that in the Scottish Parliament. The GTC have made it clear that they are very worried about it, because they believe that the legislation, and there has been no amendment to address this so far from the UK government, will create the circumstances in which their procedures are at risk. There is a procedure for those who come from England to teach in Scotland. It is a procedure which they are responsible for, and which allows qualification to be gained, sometimes in a reasonably fast way, and that's very positive. But they have to have qualification. In addition, there is now a compulsory qualification for headship, something, again, I supported when I was education secretary. There is no such compulsory qualification in England. So for all those reasons, the GTC, by no means a body of mad gnats, but a very responsible, independent body, says, we have worries about this bill. I think Michael Gove should have addressed those and should have made an absolute commitment to amending the bill to make sure that that does not happen. He did not do so. And you draw an inference from that he doesn't intend to do so, and therefore he's not unhappy that possibility of interfering in Scottish education still exists.
I mean, I think Mr. Gove's kind of argument was that really he and his colleagues are such nice people that we should really trust them. And even though the bill gives them powers, they are so nice that they wouldn't actually use these powers. I mean, do you find that argument convincing?
I suspect you know the answer to that. I do not find it convincing. I notice a number of people who have commented on the bill have made the same point. These are very, very wide-ranging powers. But the defence appeared, at least until today, because everything changes all the time, but the defence appeared to be, well, we're not going to use much of them, and you shouldn't really. I'm sorry, I do not believe that at all.
Thank you. And the final area I wanted to touch on was the minimum pricing of alcohol, which there have been concerns raised that either, well, it has been introduced, so we should be able to keep it. But if we were to, say, increase the unit price dramatically, that could be challenged. Now, again, Mr. Gove's answer seemed to be, well, it's only if it's a very blatant ban, like we ban Buckfast or we ban English cider or something like that. And again, they wouldn't interfere. Do you feel there is a real risk here with something like minimum pricing?
Of course. I mean, I just think it's obvious. I mean, remember, the Tory opposition to this, in Scotland, the Scottish Tories opposition to that. Would they not be encouraging a UK government that had the power to interfere with that? Imagine if that had happened. We were able to do minimum unit pricing. It was difficult. It was hard work. We were able to do it because there was the flexibility in the European system. There is no such flexibility here. And if you just think back to debates upon it, which I know you were part of and I remember well, in all those circumstances, I absolutely believe that would be exactly the type of thing that they wouldn't want to happen. You also want to take a sort of parallel here and look at the type of criticism and sniping when we do different things. Even in the real, really, really difficult area of coronavirus regulation, when we do different things, then there is sniping from Tories, particularly, about whether things should be different or not. So, I mean, there is a deep dislike, I've said this before to the Committee of Devolution, at the heart of the current UK government. And it is unfortunately being aided and abetted by Scottish Tories.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Jackie Bailey, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I, of course, welcome the Cabinet Secretary's defence of devolution. When I don't know if he was listening, I suspect he was, to the session with Michael Gove, he seemed to suggest that he would be willing to pause to try and gain consensus on the bill, although I suspect that might be more what I hoped to hear than what he actually said. Do you consider there is any prospect of more substantive amendments coming forward that would make the bill more acceptable to you?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, I think it's a very good question. Like I say, I welcome Jackie Bailey to this committee. I'm sure she's going to test me as well as others. And I think it is a very good question because I think the bill is deeply flawed in conception, because I think that what it tries to do is to create a mechanism to undermine devolution. But, if, for example, the bill was to be amended so that there was a consultative process, issues that perhaps provided some statutory underpinning to the frameworks, I would be prepared to sit down and discuss it. I find it unlikely that would happen given where the UK government is, but I'm not, as Jackie Bailey knows, an unreasonable person. So if Michael Gove came along and said, I want to sit down and discuss this to see if we can find a way forward, I think the Welsh and ourselves would be probably willing to do so, and probably Northern Irish would. We haven't mentioned Northern Ireland much. The issues of Northern Ireland, of course, are very complicated in this bill because they not only deal with the issues of the internal market, they also deal with the issues of the protocol. The wisest thing to do would be to withdraw this bill and to return to the table on frameworks. But if there was a face-saving measure, and Boris Johnson constantly looks for face-saving measures in negotiations, then of course we would discuss a face-saving measure.
I think that's really helpful to know, because given that it would appear that the devolved nations are likely to reject the bill in its current form, then it's perhaps difficult for the UK government to legislate without consent from any of the devolved nations. So would you make that suggestion to get round the negotiating table again? Because I appreciate that time is pressing. Is that something you would take a lead on?
Well, I mean, I'm never reluctant to take a lead, but I'm not sure my lead would be followed by Michael Gove. But this discussion is on the record; it is public, and if Michael Gove is listening with the same attention that I listen to him, perhaps even more so, then maybe he will take it forward. I think the Welsh are also key players in this, and I know the Welsh want to see changes taking place. These can't be cosmetic changes, and they cannot accept the principle that the rights of the devolved administrations to legislate within their areas of competence, which I'm sure you would agree, cannot be constrained. There is a reserved powers model. It should not be interfered with, and changes should be by consent. But if there's a desire for a video conference on this today or any other day, I'm on for it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you, Jackie. I've got a couple of further questioners to the Cabinet Secretary. So firstly to Alec Rowley, that will be followed up by Angela Conson. Alec Rowley?
I'm here. Yeah, you hear me now? Yeah.
You know, yeah. I'm not getting your picture, but we hear you, Alec. Just keep going though.
Okay, so 2 quick points. Yesterday, the Michael Gove, and you keep hearing this from the Boris Johnson Scottish Labour Party, Scottish Tory Party, that there is going to be a serious power surge, is Mr. Gove's claim, that we're going to have all these powers coming to us. So I think that's got to be addressed and answered. And he then, so yesterday continually says, we are the party of the National Health Service, we are the party of animal welfare and animal rights. But in every one of these areas, would you agree that legislating to allow a weakening of animal rights, for example, or a weakening of the protection around our health service and public services, why would you legislate in every one of these areas to allow in the future the health service to be attacked or privatised? Why would you do that if you are so determined and committed to protecting these services? I wonder, Mr. Russell.
Yeah, I mean, I think let me come to the power surge finally, but on that, they don't tend to use the powers that they're giving themselves. Why are they giving themselves the powers? I mean, you have to ask yourself that question. There is absolutely no threat to trading between these islands, none whatsoever. In the whole period that this has been discussed, Gove has not been able to come up, or anybody else, with a single, specific, clear threat. Nobody's making any proposals to threaten that. So they're only giving themselves these powers because they intend to use them. These powers could only be used if you have lower standards. You agree lower standards, then you impose those lower standards on other people. I just do not believe that the commitment to high standards will, in the end, survive the brutal requirements of a free trade treaty, for example, with the US, where agriculture will have to be part of that. There's no doubt about it, where health services and pharmaceuticals will have to be part of that. And we are being softened up for that. With a variety of statements about never using it, they will be used. So we have to be clear about that. Mr. Riley, in terms of power surges, I'll come on to the detail in a moment, but I'm sitting here in rural Argyll and I'm looking at my broadband router, which I have lost twice because of power surges. Power surges can be very, very destructive. They blow things up. Power surge isn't a good thing. It's a bad thing in that sense. There is no power surge in terms of powers to the Scottish. This is really a very, very bad misleading of people. When you look at the list of powers, areas of the Scottish Parliament intersect with the powers that were with the EU and the powers with the UK. But what is happening is one partner is dropping out of that. And the question then means, how do you share that out? Now, the UK is taking to itself the lead role in all of those areas, because it can undermine us in all of those areas. So even if there was some additional power, you couldn't exercise it. But there isn't, because we are still able to do the things we were doing. We have passed an animal welfare bill this year.
That's one of these areas of intersection. We have very, very strong and complex food regulation. That's one of these areas too. There is no such power surge. There were lots of remarks about power surges during the 2016 European referendum. One, Michael Gove, said that the Scottish Parliament would get powers, for example, on immigration. That is what Michael Gove promised the people of Scotland during the 2016 referendum. Did it happen? Now he thinks it's the worst thing that could possibly happen. So, there is no power surge. Be careful who's telling you this, because they've got previous on these matters.
Okay, Alec?
Yeah, thank you.
Right, Angela, Constance, please.
Thank you, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Clause 48 of the Internal Market Bill effectively reserves state aid to Westminster, despite this not being reserved in the Scotland Act. And I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary agreed with the STUC and other commentators that it's really hard to see how this is not anything other than a power grab by the UK government. And I'm sure he also agrees with the STUC when they say that the Scottish Parliament should have meaningful powers over the Scottish economy. And I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary had any views about how this power grab over state aid could impinge on the Scottish Government seeking to give financial support to workplaces threatened with closure.
Yeah, state aid is a very crucial area in re-reservation. There's no doubt about that. Even the Commons Public Accounts and Constitution Committee has made it clear this is a re-reservation. So this is taking something away that existed. It was an area we were never able to get agreement on when we were discussing the frameworks. The only area we couldn't agree the need for a framework. And clearly it was because they wanted to take this away. They want to take it away because they want to disengage from a state aid structure that presently exists in the EU and not even have their own state aid structure, but actually at the present moment simply tie themselves to what is a very weak, badly developed state aid structure with the WTO, which is now said that they've done. So first of all, it is it's a reservation. It means that we cannot do some of the things we would want to do, and you need a knowledge of the economy to do it. The European framework was useful because you knew what the overall guidance was, but then there were specific issues you could address. And indeed, we did during the pandemic how flexible the EU actually became about state aid when it needed to be flexible about state aid. So it will weaken the Scottish ability to deal with the economy. EU position on this is interesting because the EU is saying, look, we've got a major competitor right on, literally on our doorstep, which we will believe will use state aid to buy in companies, not just to prop up ailing companies, but to buy in companies. And if we have then a free trade arrangement with the EU, then they will be able to export at preferential rates into the EU. So it's a very, very sensitive area for them. The right way to deal with state aid is by negotiation. They should have left the situation where we all had a share in it, and they could have developed their own structure. They haven't done so, and they're weakening Scotland as a result. They're also going to weaken themselves because that's one of the reasons they will be treated nervously as trading partners.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary, and I have no further questions, Convener.
Thank you very much, Angela. Can I also thank Mr Russell for his evidence today? The committee expects to set out its views on the LCM next week. As the committee previously agreed to take the next item in private, I now close this public part of the meeting, and members should now join the committee's private session at MS Teams in a few minutes. Thank you very much.